The air seemed to vibrate with the heat of that summer morning as James walked through the supermarket parking lot. 16 years of life had already taught him enough. Never get involved, never care more than necessary. It was a rule that kept his existence simple, orderly, and free of complications. Beads of sweat ran down his forehead as he moved between the gleaming cars under the relentless sun. That's when he heard it. At first, just a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper lost in the wind. James stopped, tilting his head slightly. There was again a cry, fragile, desperate, a baby. His eyes scanned the parking lot until they found the source. A gray sedan, all windows closed, parked for at least 2 hours under the scorching sun. The car's interior was an oven, and inside it, a tiny life was fighting to survive. Is anyone seeing this? James shouted, looking around. People passed by, shopping carts full, no one seeming to notice or care. The crying was growing weaker by the second. James knew about not getting involved. He knew that other people's problems were just that, other people's. They weren't his to solve. It was what his father always said before disappearing into drunken nights, what his mother murmured when she shut the bedroom door to ignore the shouting. It was a lesson life had carved into his skin. But something inside him, something stronger than 16 years of carefully built defenses, rebelled against that worn-out truth. In an instant, James grabbed a fire extinguisher near the market entrance and, without hesitation, smashed the car's rear window. The heat that escaped nearly knocked him back, a suffocating wave that signaled the imminent danger. He stretched inside, ignoring the shards of glass cutting into his arms, until he reached the baby in the car seat. The child was no longer crying. His lips had a bluish hue. His skin was flushed and dangerously hot. He's not breathing properly, James realized, panic rising in his throat like acid. With the baby in his arms, he ran. He ran like he had never run before, away from the parking lot, toward the nearest pharmacy on the corner. There was no thought, only pure instinct. His legs seemed driven by a force beyond his comprehension, while the small weight in his arms anchored him to the reality of that moment. "I need help," he shouted as he burst through the pharmacy doors. A baby in a car, he needs a doctor. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, reacted immediately. With a calmness that only comes from experience, she took the baby, carried him to the back of the store, and began administering first aid, while another employee called emergency services. "How did you find him?" Sarah asked, her experienced hands assessing the child. "In the supermarket parking lot. Windows closed. He'd been there for hours," James replied, his words coming out in gasps, the adrenaline finally giving way to shock. As the ambulance siren began to wail in the distance, James watched the small child, a boy, no more than a few months old. How could someone leave him like that? The question burned in his mind, intertwining with another even more unsettling one. What would have happened if he had followed his rule? If he had just walked past, like everyone else? The ambulance arrived in minutes that felt like hours. Paramedics rushed in, taking over the baby's care. One of them turned to James. "Did you get him out of the car?" he asked while preparing the baby for transport. James nodded, unable to speak. "You saved his life," the paramedic said simply. A few more minutes. He didn't need to finish the sentence. James knew. Everyone in the pharmacy knew. When the police arrived shortly after, James's world turned upside down. Questions, statements, detailed descriptions. He answered mechanically, still seeing those tiny bluish lips, still feeling the weight of the baby in his arms. "We found the parents." An officer informed him hours later at the hospital, where James waited without really knowing why. He could have left. He should have left. But something kept him there, tied to a story that wasn't his. They were? The officer hesitated, choosing his words. They were at a nearby bar. They say they thought they had left the windows open. Rage surged through James like a storm, sudden and overwhelming. They left the baby in a car to go drinking? The officer just looked at him. his tired eyes revealing that this wasn't the first time, nor would be the last, that he had witnessed such neglect. At that moment, under the cold hospital hallway lights, something shattered and reassembled inside James. The cruel truth behind that abandonment didn't just destroy his certainties. It planted something new in him, still unnamed but undeniably powerful. "He's gonna be okay," a nurse said, approaching. "You got there in time." James looked through the slightly open door at the small being sleeping peacefully, tubes and monitors around him making his fragility even more evident. "What's his name?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Noah," the nurse replied. "His name is Noah." Noah, a name that meant rest, comfort, a name that spoke of survival after storm. James didn't know it then, but that name would become part of his own story, intertwined with fate in ways he could never have imagined. The days following that rescue slipped through James's fingers like sand. The image of little Noah, with his bluish lips, had etched itself into his memory like a photograph that refused to fade. At night, he woke up startled, the phantom weight of a baby still in his arms. Life in the small apartment James shared with his mother continued with the same worn-out routine. Kelly worked 2 jobs, came home late, too exhausted for conversations. "You could have gotten hurt," she murmured one night, running her fingers over the bandages on James's arms. "But you did the right thing." Coming from her, those words carried particular weight. Kelly knew the price of getting involved, of trying to save someone. She had tried to save her husband from alcoholism for years, until exhaustion forced her to choose between protecting herself and her son or continuing a hopeless battle. School became a minefield of unwanted attention. The boy who had always preferred the sidelines was now the center of every conversation. "Hero," some whispered. "Lucky," others said, referring to the supermarket's reward, $500, which he accepted thinking about the overdue bills. "I don't get why this is such a big deal," James commented to Olivia during lunch. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't," she replied firmly. "Dozens of people walked past that car, James. No one stopped. Only you." The truth of her words unsettled him. Because if so many people had ignored it, what did that say about the world? And if he had been different, what did that say about him? On the 3rd night after the incident, the doorbell rang. Kelly hadn't returned from her 2nd shift yet. James opened the door to find a middle-aged woman, graying hair, red-rimmed eyes. "Are you James?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. "I'm Martha Sullivan," she introduced herself. Noah's grandmother. The name hit James like a punch. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had something happened? "He's fine," Martha said quickly. "Thanks to you." Inside the small living room, Martha seemed out of place, like an exotic flower in an abandoned garden. But there was something in her eyes, a familiar sadness, a weariness James recognized. "My daughter and her husband have serious problems. Drugs, mostly. They lost custody of Noah," she continued. "I'm taking care of him now." Martha opened her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside, there was a photograph. Noah, in a crib, big blue eyes, rosy cheeks. Alive. "I also brought this," she said, taking out another envelope. "It's not money. It's an opportunity." The regional hospital was offering an internship program for young people interested in healthcare careers. A spot had been reserved for James, if he wanted it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Martha looked out the window. "Because when you saved Noah, you gave me a chance to make a difference in his life. Maybe it's time someone offered you the same." When Martha left, James remained seated, Noah's photograph in one hand, the letter in the other. On the fridge in the kitchen, a drawing James had made at 8 years old was still hanging. A doctor, wearing a white coat, smiling. A childhood dream, abandoned when life convinced him that some paths weren't meant for people like him. Kelly arrived home and found her son sitting at the kitchen table. Without words, he showed her the letter. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice carrying a rare vulnerability. Kelly studied her son for a long moment. I think some people are born to make a difference. That night, for the first time in years, James slept without nightmares. Instead of the weight of the baby in his arms, he carried the weight of a choice, one that felt like coming home after a long journey. 3 months passed. Autumn had arrived, painting the trees in golden hues. James now walked the hospital corridors 3 times a week, his intern uniform still feeling stiff on his body. The program was more demanding than he had imagined. Long hours, sometimes monotonous tasks. But there were moments of clarity, when he held a hand of a confused elderly patient, when he saw the relief in a child's eyes after a frightening procedure. You have a knack for this, Dr. Eleanor Ross observed after watching him calm down a little boy. You have a reassuring presence. At school, only Olivia remained constant, listening to his stories about the hospital. You seem different, she commented one afternoon in the library. More present. What do you mean? Before, it was like you were always looking through people. Now, you actually seem to be here. It was in this reflective state that James entered the pediatric ward. Nancy, the head nurse, intercepted him. I need you to go to room 302. We need an intern there while the doctor is doing rounds on another floor. Upon entering the room, James was immediately met with a familiar scent of antiseptic. A small hospital crib occupied the center, surrounded by medical equipment. A woman sat beside it, Martha Sullivan. James, what are you doing here? Before he could answer, his eyes landed on the crib. There, connected to tubes and monitors, was Noah, pale, his chest rising and falling with a disturbingly slow rhythm. What happened? James asked, stepping closer to the crib. Pneumonia. It started as a cold, but worsened quickly. The doctors say his immune system is compromised, a consequence of his first months of life. Where are his parents? My daughter is in rehab, this time by her own choice. Her husband disappeared after they lost custody. James looked at Noah's tiny body, so vulnerable against the white sheets. The injustice of it all hit him like a physical blow. He'll be okay, James said. He's strong. Martha nodded, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. This is his second hospitalization in 2 months. I'll stay with him, James finally said. You need to rest. After Martha left, James pulled the chair closer to the crib. During the worst of the fever, he did something that surprised even himself. Carefully, avoiding the tubes and wires, he picked up the child in his arms. You'll get through this, he whispered. You already survived the worst. Dr. Ross found him like that when she returned, James holding Noah, humming softly. This isn't standard protocol, she remarked, though without reproach. His fever is going down, she observed, checking the monitors. When Martha returned, she found Noah sleeping peacefully, and beside the crib, James had also fallen asleep, one hand still stretched through bars, his fingers intertwined with the tiny ones of the baby. It was at that moment that the door opened. A young woman entered, messy blonde hair, a pale face marked by drug use, but with the same blue eyes as Noah. Beside her stood an older man in a suit, holding a briefcase. Mom, I came to see my son. Emma, I wasn't expecting you here. The man cleared his throat. I'm Jonathan Mercer, your daughter's attorney. Emma has completed the first stage of rehab. The court is reconsidering custody. James felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The small miracle that had been unfolding. Noah's recovery, the connection he had begun to feel, now hung in delicate balance. No matter what happens, he silently promised, I won't disappear from your life. The following weeks passed in a blur of court hearings, supervised visits, and long conversations between Martha, Emma, and the social workers handling Noah's case. James attended every meeting he could, even when no one expected him to. He wasn't sure why he fought so hard to stay involved. He only knew that he couldn't walk away. Not from Noah, not from the life he had saved. At the hospital, his internship continued. He learned to take vitals, assist with basic procedures, and most importantly, listen. Patients came and went, but Noah's case stayed with him. "You look exhausted," Olivia remarked one afternoon as they sat outside the school. James rubbed his face. "Just a lot going on." "You're not his father, James." He tensed. "I know that, but you're acting like you are." He didn't respond, because deep down he knew she was right. The final custody hearing arrived faster than he expected. Martha and Emma sat side by side at the courthouse, tension thick between them. James sat in the back, hands clenched into fists. The judge read through the reports, the progress Emma had made, the concerns raised by social services, the bond Noah had formed with his grandmother, based on the evidence presented. The judge finally said, "The court grants provisional custody of Noah to Emma Sullivan under strict supervision for the next 6 months. Any violation of the terms set forth will result in immediate reevaluation." James felt his stomach drop. It was the outcome he had feared. Emma turned, her eyes meeting his. "I won't mess this up," she whispered. James wanted to believe her. He really did. Martha squeezed his shoulder gently. "He'll need people who care about him in his life. That includes you, James." But would it be enough? Days passed. James tried to focus on school, on his internship, but his mind always drifted back to Noah. Then, one evening, the doorbell rang. James opened the door to find Emma standing there, Noah in her arms. She hesitated. "I thought maybe you'd like to see him." James stared at her, then at Noah, his big blue eyes blinking up at him. Carefully, almost hesitantly, Emma handed the baby over. James held him, the weight familiar, grounding. Noah cooed softly, his tiny fingers grasping James's shirt. Emma watched them for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know if I can do this alone." James met her gaze. "You're not alone." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. From that night on, everything began to change, slowly, like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. Emma started visiting once a week, always with Noah wrapped in a soft blanket in her arms. At first, she barely spoke, her hands trembling as she handed the baby to James. He would hold Noah carefully, rocking him in silence while Emma watched in the corner of the room, as if afraid she might break him. With each visit, the fear in her eyes began to fade, just a little. James didn't ask about the past. He knew better than anyone how heavy some wounds could be. Instead, he showed her how to hold Noah when he was restless, how to soothe him when the fever returned. He taught her the little things no one had taught him. One night, as Emma was leaving, she paused at the door. "You really care about him, don't you?" James looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms, his small chest rising and falling steadily. "I guess I do." Emma's voice cracked. "Thank you for not giving up on him." James swallowed hard. I think he saved me more than I saved him." Weeks turned into months. Winter settled over the city, painting the streets in shades of gray. James balanced school, the internship, and the quiet visits with Noah. His life had never been busier, yet for the first time it felt full. At the hospital, Dr. Ross began giving him more responsibilities. "You've got potential, James," she told him one evening. Real potential. He still wasn't used to hearing those words. At school, Olivia remained his constant companion. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked one afternoon, flipping through a biology textbook. James stared out the window, lost in thought. "Yes, sometimes." And he glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think I want to be a doctor." Olivia's eyes widened. "You? Why not?" She grinned. "I always knew there was something different about you." James's heart stirred at those words, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A message from Emma. Noah's in the hospital again. "Can you come?" He was there within the hour. When he stepped into the pediatric ward, the familiar antiseptic smell filled his lungs. Emma sat in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Noah lay in the crib, connected to machines, his small body fighting another infection. James walked over silently, his heart clenching. Without asking, he reached through the bars of the crib and took the baby's tiny hand in his own, just like he had done months ago. "You're gonna get through this," he whispered. "You're the strongest little guy I know." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but this time she didn't look away. "You really love him, don't you?" James's throat tightened. "He's family." Noah recovered, again, and little by little, Emma did too. She finished rehab, got a job at a small cafe. She stumbled. Sometimes there were days when the weight of everything nearly broke her, but she always came back. James never stopped showing up. By the time spring arrived, the court granted Emma full custody. On the day the papers were signed, Emma showed up at James's apartment with Noah in her arms. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. "You don't have to." "I do." She looked down at Noah, his chubby fingers clutching James's shirt like he always did. "I wouldn't be here without you." James's chest tightened. "You're a good mom, Emma." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm trying." "You're not alone." Emma nodded, wiping her face. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. James holding Noah at the hospital months ago, both of them asleep, their hands still intertwined. On the back, Emma had written just 4 words. "Family isn't always blood." Years from now, James would look back at that summer day in the parking lot and realize it had changed everything. Not just for Noah, not just for Emma, but for him too. He would never forget the weight of that tiny body in his arms, the weight that anchored him to a life he never thought he deserved. And in the quiet spaces of his heart, long after Noah learned to walk, to talk, to laugh, James would always carry the promise he made that day. "No matter what happens, I won't disappear from your life."